Hello, students. Today we will discuss the story The Gold Frame, written by R.K. Laxman. Students, we have already discussed some part of the story in our previous lecture, and today we will continue with the same story and with the remaining part of this story. As we have already discussed that R.K. Laxman, who was India's greatest cartoonist. He has written this story, and in this story, there is a picture frame maker whose name is Datta. He was a hard-working and a silent frame maker. One day, a customer comes to his shop. He wanted a frame for a photograph he had brought with him, and that photograph was the grandfather that photograph was of his grandfather. The customer wanted the best frame for the photograph, so Lata promised to keep his photograph ready in 2 weeks. And let's today continue with the remaining part. Datta had learned by long experience that his customers never came punctually. Either they came in advance and went away disappointed, or they came months later and some of his customers never turned up. So, Datta, the frame maker, he had a very long experience that his customers never came punctually. Punctually means on time. Either they came in advance and went away disappointed, or being disappointed means being unhappy, or they came months later and some of his customers never turned up to take their photographs framed. Therefore, he waited for them at least twice before executing their orders. So, before executing their orders, execute means to give any to give an action, to take an action for any work. So before preparing their photographs or framing their photographs, he waited for his customers for at least twice. 10 days later, the rustic looking customer came and asked if his frame was ready. Actually, he had come 4 days early. So Datta had a very long experience that his customers sometimes they came in advance and sometimes they came months later. The next morning, Datta made his first job. So, like that, his customer who had given Datta the photograph of his grandfather to frame, he came to his shop and asked Datta if the frame was ready. Actually, he had come 4 days early. So, next morning, Datta made his first job, keeping aside all the others. So, next day, Datta he tries to frame that picture of the customer's grandfather. He wanted to finish the frame for the photograph. He took the picture out carefully and kept it on the wooden plank. So he takes the photograph of the customer's grandfather and places it carefully on the wooden plank. Plank is a big piece of wood. As usual, his pencil stub was missing and he was frustrated. Finally, he stood up and shook his dhoti so violently that he upset tin containing enamel paint. So when he tries to find out his pencil stub, he was so frustrated and shook he shook his dhoti so violently that the enamel paint uh, containing tin gets upset. Unfortunately, the paint spilled on the photograph, and unfortunately, the paint it spills. It gets spilled on the photograph. Datta stood transfixed. He could not recover from the transfixed state he had created. Datta stood transfixed. He could not recover from the transfixed state he had created. So, in that position, Datta stood transfixed. He could not recover from the transfixed state he had created. When at last he fully recovered his senses, he set about rescuing the picture. So after the paint getting spilled on the photograph, Datta becomes so confused that he could not recover his senses. When at last he is fully recovered and he fully recovers his senses, he set about rescuing the picture of the customer's grandfather. He rubbed the picture so hard with a cloth and then he peeled off thin strips of the filmy coating from its surface. In order to make the picture clean, he rubbed the picture so hard with a cloth and that the thin strips of the filmy coating are rubbed from that picture, are peeled off from that picture. Before he realized what he had done, half the old man's face and nearly his entire turban were gone. Before realizing what he has done, he observes that half the old man's face and nearly his entire turban, both of those were gone, means they were peeled off from the surface of that photograph. Datta was now worried about how he would answer his customer who had a fanatic devotion to the photograph. So, when he spoiled the photograph, now he was worried about what he would answer to that customer who had a fanatic devotion to the photograph, because that was the photograph of his beloved of his lovely grandfather. Datta racked his brain for a long while till he was overtaken by exhaustion. So he puts a stress upon his burden, upon his brain to think what he can do now. And while thinking about that photograph, to recover that photograph, he was overtaken by exhaustion. In his state of mind, it did not occur to him that a particular photograph on the wall had caught his attention. And when he was thinking about that photograph, he finds that a photograph on the wall was similar to the photograph of that customer's grandfather. It was an ordinary portrait of a middle aged man. Datta was amazed to see that he had the resemblance to the old man in the photograph. It was an ordinary portrait of a middle aged man. What he notices um, that the picture, that the portrait that was hung on the wall in front of him, there was a picture of an ordinary middle-aged man. Datta was amazed to see that he had the resemblance to the old man in the photograph. So both the photographs of the old man and that picture which was hung in front of him, both were same. An idea struck Datta. He brought down the old wooden box. He found a lot of photographs he could pick, which looked more or less like the old man. Then an idea came to his mind. He brought down the old wooden box in which there were so many pictures which were framed by Datta. So he found a lot of photographs he could pick, which looked more or less like the old man's photograph. At last, Datta found one photograph which could replace the old man. After a couple of hours, he had a resplendent looking photograph in front of him. It had a gold frame asked by the customer. So, after looking for a long time, he finds one photograph which could replace the photograph of that old man, which was resplendent means which was brightly colored. So that photograph had a gold frame, and the customer had asked him to frame that photograph in a gold frame. The days that followed were filled with the suspense and anxiety. Anxiety means to get worry about something. Datta was nervous about the hoax he had played. Hoax means uh, act of cheating with someone. At last, the customer came for his photograph. Datta's heart began to race. Nevertheless, he gave the photograph to the customer. So, after replacing someone else's photograph with the photograph of that customer's grandfather, the days that followed, those were filled with suspense and worry. He was nervous. Datta was nervous that he had played a kind of deception. He has acted as a cheater. At last, the customer came for his photograph. Datta's heart began to race. It began to beat with a very fast speed. Nevertheless, he gave the photograph to the customer. The customer was struck by its grandeur. He was silent like one who entered the inner sanctum of a temple. Datta held his breath and watched the customer's expression. Suddenly, the customer straightened up and asked indignantly, "What have you done?" So the customer, after taking the picture from Datta, he was struck. He was amazed by its grandeur. Grandeur means um something very beautiful, glorious. He was amazed by the beautiful framing of that picture. He was silent like one who entered the inner sanctum of a temple. He was so wonderstruck, so amazed and surprised, as if he have entered any sanctity of a temple. Datta held his breath and watched the customer's expression. Suddenly, the customer straightened up and asked indignantly, "What have you done?" When the customer straightened up the photograph that was framed by Datta, he asked indignantly, "What have you done?" Datta stood silent for a moment. He had rehearsed for this situation for a long time. Datta stood silent for a moment. He becomes speechless after hearing a question from the customer. "What have you done?" Before he could speak, the customer said that he had asked for an oval gold frame, whereas Datta had out a square gold frame. Why he was pointing out to Datta? He wanted to know that uh, because he had asked Datta for an oval shaped gold frame, whereas Datta had out a square gold frame. Sorry, yes, square gold frame. He was, that's why he put a question to Datta, because the customer wanted oval shaped gold frame, but Datta had framed it in a square shape. Though Datta was prepared for all kinds of questions, this was unexpected. Thus, R.K. Laxman tries to bring about the humor through the absent minded customer and cunning shop owner. So, Datta was prepared for the situation that the customer will put so many questions to him regarding the framed photograph. But what happens now, it was unexpected. Thus, in this way, R.K. Laxman tries to bring out the humor means funny elements, through the absent-mindedness of the customers, and cunningness means cleverness, smartness of the shop owner. So this is the story, the gold frame. Tomorrow we will continue with our next lecture. Thank you. Thank you very much.